Hello? Is anyone there? While we sit and wait, I'm going to see if this is working. Boo! Anybody there in the chat? Doing anything? Hanging out? I know we just hit 4 on the button, so we might sit a second. I have to find my own tweet. Because, you know, what's the point of shouting into the void if there aren't people in the void to shout back at you? Boop ba doo boop boop ba doo 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 do 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 ba doo boo. Can you all hear me and see me? Maybe. Hopefully. I hope and pray. Okay. Let's see where we're at. Just sent that tweet out. It looks like there are 2 people watching. If you could hear me, that would be great. Or if you could let me know that you're hearing me. But if not, that's not a big deal. Sorry, you'll also be hearing, and I'll probably say this again if more folks show up, you'll be hearing people, or you'll be hearing planes, not people. You'll be hearing planes flying overhead. That is because I live very close to an airport, and the airport so I just have planes constantly, and that's where I'm at, and that's where I live with my life. So, party on, Garth. I think we're just gonna hang out. Hi, Phil! Can you hear me okay? And see me and all that jazz? Because this is in a weird spot in my room, in my office. It's not an office, this is just another corner. I'm not where I usually am when I'm streaming. Awesome! Hi, Susan! Thanks and welcome here. We're gonna start in like 2 minutes. I'm just gonna give folks time to be here. Yes, this is my like library book corner that I never use or sit at because normally there are boxes back here. But it looked like this before I like even cleaned. You know, this is just where like I have books and shit. I have a lot of books. I also have, I will not show you because it is horrifying to me, an immense number of books on the floor, library books, books I own, notebooks. And there's more at school. And so this is my life. I'm just cursed. I just have too many freaking books. Yeah. So it's really like a problem because I keep ordering more because I'm at a point where I'm like trying to build my own library. Because I need it for research purposes and stuff. Need it. I like to have it on hand because sometimes you're like, oh fuck, this citation. Like I was just writing something yesterday and I couldn't remember if it was in this book or in this article that I'd read. And so I was like, shit. And I was really glad I had that book. And that's only going to get worse as I try to write more things. So yeah, I read digital books too, Phil. I get Goodreads deals every day from Goodreads. They're like Kindle deals, and also I have a problem with that, where I buy too many books, and sometimes if a book gets recalled through our interlibrary loan service, I'll just buy it on Kindle because I'm like, well, I have to return the library book, so I may as well own the book since I didn't read it before the library had to get it back. And sometimes you just need it. This is my horrible life. So, it's 4:05, so we're gonna get started. Thank you, everyone who's in the chat right now, or folks who are just watching, but may not be in the chat. Easy for me to say. For those of you that don't know, my name is I. I am a 24 and a half and change year old non-binary trans bisexual person, but I also use like the words dyke and butch to talk about myself. There will probably be an episode or 100,000 episodes or whatever these are things we're calling another stream, where I talk more about that and like the particularities of bisexual and lesbian cultures and the overlap and why there is an overlap and where the boundaries are and borders and things like that. So hi Sunrel, thanks for showing up. I'm also a white settler currently living on Dakota traditional homelands. I was raised and currently am middle class. I'm a US born US citizen, and the US, the current US settler state. I speak English. I've had a bunch of foreign language training over the years in 3 different languages, and I speak none of them well except English. I barely speak English well, as evidenced by that sentence. Yeah, Sunrel, that's great. I'm just glad to have you pop in however long. I am trying to record these, so we'll see. Maybe they'll go up on my YouTube page later if I can figure out how to make that happen. So, but I appreciate to have you here however long you are. Yeah, so I speak English. I was raised sort of Catholic. I claim I left the church when I was 10. I walked out when my sister's confirmation was happening. I was never confirmed myself, but I am at a place in my ex-Catholic career where I am appreciating the aesthetics of Catholic culture. And so I've come not full circle where I'm like, oh, I believe again, but I'm somewhere on that cycle. What else? I'm literally just reading all of this list of things that I wrote about myself to give you all a sense of where I'm coming from, because I do think, right, like, I'm queer, and that's the where this series is coming from is my knowledge of, like, queer culture and who I am as a queer person. But I also want to own up to what I would refer to as my agent identities, the ones that give me more agency in the culture that we live in, because it's really important to consider who you're getting the information that you're going to hopefully get in this series from. So those are sort of my identities as I remember to lay them out. Oh, also I have anxiety and depression and a kind of undiagnosed, on purpose, PTSD. I'm in therapy. Not that that's any of your business, but again, this is the joke in this title is that it's the confessional. If I do a talk about Foucault, if any of you care to hear about Foucault, beyond that he's a fisting bottom, which I feel like is something that most people who know me know, even if they don't know other things about Foucault. You may probably also know that I am currently a graduate student seeking a PhD in history. I just finished my 2nd year of coursework. I will have another year probably. Definitely, I don't know why I have that probably face going on. I will definitely have another year of coursework because that's just what I have to get done. I have to finish my language requirement and just get more credits. I did not come in with a master's, so I came directly from undergrad. My dissertation, though, is looking at, yeah, I know I'm a huge nerd. It's like a huge problem. But my dissertation is looking at queer and trans death. Specifically, right now, the time period is very weird, especially given that I'm studying history. It goes from, like, the AIDS crisis through, or, like, what we temporally call the AIDS crisis, which we'll talk about, that's fake, through, like, the suicide crisis that we're experiencing now among queer and trans folks, not just youth. today. So that's what I look at. I look at death itself and also the political uses of death. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's my extremely bad elevator pitch, but hopefully things will get figured out and I will come out of the other side with a degree and a dissertation finished. In undergrad, I majored in history with a double minor in American Studies, which is a way I use to study specifically American history and have it count towards my degree. And a self-designed minor in social justice dialogue, I think is what the official terms are. I don't know. My advisor added it to my degree form a week before I graduated because we realized I had done all this coursework, and she was like, may as well. I think actually what she said is, I love to piss the registrar off. So I have that. While I was in undergrad, I wrote a thesis about the history of transition, particularly transitional healthcare for trans people, that spanned sort of the course of the 20th century. And that was supposed to be my dissertation, and then I turned into myself and ended up being like, actually, I really need to talk about death now. So that's where we're at. But I do, obviously, I'm still really interested in the way that trans people navigate healthcare and the way that the system has been working to prevent us from doing that. What else about me? I have all this stuff about, my teaching. I don't know if you all are interested in that, but that's where I'm coming from in this. So, in undergrad, I co-facilitated 2 intergroup dialogues. One was about gender beyond the binary. So basically it was looking at holding dialogues about gender between transgender people and cisgender people. We can talk more about those terms depending on how people want to get into those. I don't know. I have no idea where you all are starting it in your knowledge, and that's totally cool. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Susan, and folks getting sterilized is still relatively regular across the globe. We can definitely talk about that. I love to talk about transitional healthcare and the barriers and limitations in places, especially, in where people are like, this country has great socialized healthcare, and you're like, that doesn't mean a whole lot for trans people and transphobia. But yeah, so that's what I look at. So yeah, in undergrad, I co-facilitated dialogue between trans and cis people, and another dialogue between white folks and people of color. And then I co-taught the intergroup facilitation training. So I did a lot of working with emotions and personal experience and how that knowledge is critical to being able to the way we understand the world, right? You can't just read a freaking book and know everything. Arguably, the reason we read books is to build empathy, not to gain knowledge in the way that it's often taught in classrooms. I also was a TA for museum studies class. We did an exhibit about Captain America. It was very fun. So that's sort of my undergrad teaching experience. As a graduate student, I've only taught for a year. I have not taught my own courses because we're not allowed to do that until we finish our coursework. But I was a TA for 2 classes. This fall, I had my own section, so I was responsible for 40 kids. They're not all kids, but if you're my student, I call you a kid. We had an old man in my class this past semester who was in his 60s, and I was the kids! So bad habit on my part. But I was responsible for 40 students, and teaching supplementing really the lectures about U.S. history from pre-colonization through 1865 through this U.S. Civil War. And then this past semester, I was technically what's called a reader grader because I didn't teach except to guest when the professor was out, but I was a TA for and supplemented lectures by heckling a course about dissident sexualities in the United States. So we looked at queerness in a kind of multitude of forms, not just the way that queer is a short term for sort of LGBT or a shorthand term, but also as thinking about like Black sexuality and the way that that is queer in the sort of white, cis, heteronormative world that we function in. And I definitely have a lecture to talk about the way that settler colonialism structures both cis heteropatriarchy and also thus defines sort of settler queer identity. I really would love to talk more about that because it's a big thing I'm trying to teach as I revise that course. So really that course that I was the TA for is the impetus for doing this series, because I'm really interested in what people know and what they don't know. I love to teach about queer history and culture. I think it's fascinating. I think it's fun. But the things that I expect people to know, folks don't know, which is totally cool. Because not everyone is a freaking freak like me. And as, like, I started reading about, we'll talk a little bit about this, but, I've been interested in queer history and culture since I was like 13, and really went in hard on specifically like the past and on history in a way that I think a lot of young queer folks don't, or at least in my experience don't. So that's what I want to do, is I want to have these conversations so people know where we're coming from and have a better idea of like what's already happened so we can imagine other ways of being in the future. We'll probably talk more about that. I want to talk about the closet as a historical construction, because I think that that's really cool, and it really shifted my perspective on a lot of things. So all of this we're going to talk more about, but that's why this is appearing. In terms of my sort of like coming out story, I thought I would share this because, I don't know, people ask, and it is relevant to my life experience, which is relevant to my teaching and relevant to my interests. I came out as trans to my parents in winter of 2012. I was a sophomore in high school. I came out publicly to my whole school. I did a whole speech. I sang the Transformers theme song in front of students, faculty, staff, like over 400 people. In 2011, and that's when I started going by I full time and using my pronouns, which are Z-I-E, pronounced Z, and here, which is spelled H-I-R, but pronounced like here. I know that one's hard for people, sometimes. So, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that process. Coming out stories are not that interesting to me on a number of levels, because I'm old, and we come out all the time, and there's like a story I tell straight people, and the story I tell queer people, and then, like, it's all just basically fodder for me to judge myself about how Foucault is fucking right, and how bitter that makes me. I changed my name legally in 2014, and I am getting top surgery in 24 days. Who's counting? Susan, that's actually a really great question about pronouns and being language neutral. Obviously not really, because they sound like German feminine pronouns, right? They sound like sie und hier. Which meant it was really easy when I was transitioning for my French teacher, who was German, to just use those pronouns. So they're not gender neutral across language. I don't know that there is one, right? I know that in Sweden, right, they have one that's specifically gender neutral and meant for people. Yeah, right, so you speak German. So that's kind of the complicated piece of it that I don't know what to do with. And we can talk about that. I is also a gendered name, I think, in China or in frickin' Japan. Somebody like messaged me and was like, this is a girl, so you know, this is a girl's name in this other language. And I was like, I'm exhausted. So we can talk about the issues of finding gender neutral pronouns. I really want to talk about the use of they in English. And yeah, one of the things that is going to be limiting about this rate, which is why I laid out my sort of who I am, is I'm really US focused and Anglophone focused because I don't speak any other languages well. Yeah, Phil, Japanese, thank you, yeah. I don't speak other languages well. So that's really unfortunate, and that's on me as a US citizen of the US settler state who only speaks English, right? Like, that speaks to all of my privileges as a person. So it's complicated, basically, but also we'll learn, right, that gender is, and sexuality, both, the way that we express them, even as queer folks and as trans folks, function in a settler cultural way that really goes unnoticed and unspoken in a lot of ways. So we'll try to be very aware of that in the way that I'm teaching. There's a lot going on that's sort of raced and classed too, in pieces of queer culture that I'm going to try to be aware of, conscious of, pay attention to, because I don't want to pretend like me as like a white trans bi person is like the only way of being, or even that I'm the only person who that I held all of the knowledge. I'm just here to give you what I can and to talk about where there are divides and where there are openings. So I am, in some ways this format sucks because it really does nothing to dismantle the like, I as lecturer know all, because I don't, but this is sort of the best way. And I think it's hopefully more accessible for folks than a podcast where it becomes this sort of weird dialogue. But I don't know, I could be wrong. We could switch formats. We'll see. Oh yeah, I will probably talk about this at some point later. I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria in 2017. And I have some mixed feelings about that. We will probably talk about medicalization, and what that means, and what alternate modes might look like. It's complicated, is the short story, and the long one. Also, it's just complicated. That's going to be this whole thing, is it's complicated. And let's see. I call myself an old queer even though I'm 24 years old, and I want to talk about why. Very briefly. Because I am not hip. Like, I don't watch RuPaul's Drag Race, mostly because I don't have cable. Or I guess I do, but I don't know how to turn it on. And I'm lazy, and, like, I know some queens, and I respect what RuPaul is doing and has done. The transphobia we're going to talk about, because it's actually a product of stuff, and it's not just like that RuPaul has, lives in a transphobic society, although that is part of it. It also has to do with the way that drag has been. I'm giving you all these little tidbits. I hope it's not overwhelming. But it has to do, I think, with the way that drag is being translated in that setting, and what having outsiders looking in and asking questions about drag culture, what kind of position that puts someone like RuPaul in. And so I am so hyped to talk more about drag, because I think drag is fascinating. I think it's so interesting, and it's really exciting to me to think and talk about it. So, and to move beyond a kind of like the questions about, is it misogynistic? Is it transphobic? Is, like, what does it mean? It's specifically like it was invented by trans women. It was invented by trans women of color. Like, all of that, I think, is a product of a certain historical moment that we're living in, which is awesome. But, Phil, we're going to talk about common definitions of drag, because the answer is, once again, it's complicated. But yeah, so a lot of what I think the conversation we're in right now is a product of a certain historical moment where certain lines have been drawn between and around communities. And I think that that is one way of being. Because I think that there is a lot to be said about recognition, and we'll talk about identity building maybe, if that is interesting to you. It does matter what people, I think to the extent that, you know, historically brutality has existed, and exists still today, right? Like, we just came off of a weekend, I guess last weekend or 2 weekends ago, where we had 2 trans people murdered. And so that's, you know, I think that there's something to be said for talking about self-reliance and self-recognition and the importance of that. I think there's also something to be said for considering material conditions. And both of those have to be held right at the same time. And that's why we have these sort of complicated, hard conversations that I'm hoping to be able to have. So, I feel like I've totally rambled. Anyway, I'm really old in that I feel more comfortable talking to older queer folks, like adults, people in their 50s, because of the ways that I've spent most of my life focused on historical knowledge, and historical knowledge in a really complicated way. I don't know, it's not like more complicated, right? It's just that it's a different way of viewing queer culture that is complicated. I don't know. Part of this is also, I think, to unpack what I know and what I feel comfortable talking about, and the ways that I don't know everything as well, and there are things that other folks can teach me, and there are things that I don't know. I don't really know what I'm talking about here, but I think what I'm trying to say is, like, instead of being steeped in sort of certain cultures, like things that were happening on Logo, I mean, Jazz, I think we can make a world where folks are not murdered in 2017 for being trans, right? That's ideal. We'll talk about queer futurity too, because I'm really interested actually in what futurity lets us imagine and then lets us push for. But we'll figure that out as we move along. Yeah. What am I trying to say? Oh, just that, like, I remember when the first Queer Eye aired. I'm sure so do other people, but I remember it being, like, the gay show on TV. I remember when something that young queer people did was watch Queer as Folk. Like, 14-year-olds watch Queer as Folk, which is a really explicit... it's a really explicit TV show. It had a UK version and a US version. I watched some of it, but I was also very self-selecting. I remember the L word, sort of. Yeah, it's complicated. And so that's where my queer culture is. And I've read a ton of queer cultural theory from the 90s. And so I'm really rooted in this, like, bizarre historical moment that has since been kind of tossed aside. And that did... Yes, that's right, Susan. Yes, he did. And yeah, yes, Dr. We can talk about reading queer subtext. We will, actually. I think that's next week, is talking about queer readings and queer subtext. Because I think that's a skill that we have, but we don't have the language to talk about, and I love to talk about that. Yeah. So yeah, I just feel old, and I am constantly yelling because, like, there are pieces of history that folks don't remember, or that people tend to dismiss, or we're just in a historical moment where we're really all about talking about Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and how they started Stonewall, which I have a whole lot of feelings about, right? It's a really bizarre thing for the mainstream queer movement to have kind of picked up, even though the folks who are picking it up will say, well, no, it's not mainstream. HRC is mainstream. Marriage is mainstream. Honey, marriage is over. We got that in the US. And, but there's this thing going on, right, where trans women are being invoked, trans women of color specifically, black trans women. Sylvia Rivera, I think, was Puerto Rican, although don't quote me on that, I will look it up before I say it again. So, I think that it's really about, my moment for me, that was my, like, first foray into queer history, was AIDS history. History of the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s and late 70s. And I think that, for me, right, I'm still trying to process what that meant, and what that has meant for me as a queer and trans historian. But I think it really is about, for me, is about what are the touchstones and what can we draw and what are other ways of being? What else can we imagine, right? What does it mean? Phil, yes, the AIDS crisis as a temporal thing is something that we categorize as time, right? I just said 80s and 90s. The date that they'll give you on, I think on the official USAIDS.gov website, is like 79 to 80, maybe 81 is where their timeline starts. People had HIV in the 60s in the US. There's a really great article that I will link, especially when I talk about the AIDS crisis, I'll talk about a lot, that talks about people in, and it wasn't just coastal either. I think when people talk about the AIDS crisis, right, it's New York and San Francisco as these two gay hubs that were heavily affected by AIDS. And that's true. But in the 60s, you know, straight black folks were dying of HIV and what would be called AIDS in, like, St. Louis, Missouri. So when I say that the AIDS crisis didn't exist, what I really mean by that is the time frame that we talk about it is arbitrarily constructed and really leads to some gross ass shit in thinking about, you know, the crisis ended. No, people are still getting HIV. People are still dying from AIDS, dying from complications from AIDS to this day, right? So that's what I mean. I would not, hopefully, we don't want to suggest that these things didn't happen. And I don't think that's what you were saying. Susan, a lot of my early readings about stuff is in the context of AIDS in Africa and AIDS in Southeast Asia. But I think AIDS in the US and AIDS in Europe is something that we still need to be talking about, because particularly for queers who live in the US and in Europe, right, that has deeply impacted us whether or not we are aware of it. And that's something I'm still trying to tease out. I'm working on a piece right now, trying to have conversations with my advisors who are two older people. They're not old, but one of whom is like my mother's age, and one of whom is a generation below me, or above me, not below me. Jesus Christ, if my advisor was younger than me, I would have a heart attack. I mean, that's fine, it's just that I'm 24, and so when they got their PhD, it would be wild. But we don't, they don't talk about it to me, and that's one of the things I'm working on, is like, what do we do with this generational gap between folks? So that's what that is it's really important to me. It's important that we keep this knowledge. It's important that we keep these knowledges, right? It's important that, it's important to me that we be able to maintain a sense of how messy our community has been. Keshish, I'm not sure I understand your question. But what I'm looking at in this series, right, is thinking about how messy the overlapping communities particularly are. I think that in a lot of ways, particularly trans history has done amazing things. And I am really grateful for the work that like Susan Stryker has done and C. Riley Thornton has done and all these other amazing trans historians who are going out and doing this amazing work. That being said, I think the way often it's being taught or it's being disseminated is not actually helpful for understanding communities and for understanding the world at large, and understanding our intertwined histories, right? What is still a problem today? Homelessness, job discrimination, lack of knowledge, HIV, seroconversion, and elder healthcare, right? Lambda Legal, I think, has been pushing this case that they have, where they have a discrimination case from like a 75-year-old woman in Illinois. Yeah, that's all about the queer community. So I think, right, we have a long way to go. And that just speaks to, right, those are things that are impacting certain communities. I didn't even get into questions of like what two-spiritedness. Yes, queer youth make up a disproportionate number of homeless youth because they're kicked out of families' homes. There also are in most states in the U.S., there are no laws in place to protect folks from being kicked out of housing. So if you like rent and your landlord finds out that you're queer, you can, in a lot of places, be kicked out of your housing, and it's not a problem. The landlord could just be like, well, too bad, and kick you out on the street. Also, job discrimination has an impact on homelessness because if you can't get a job, or if you can't get a job in sort of a traditional field or what we would consider work, your precarity, right, puts you in working in sort of alternate economies. You may turn to sex work, you may turn to other kinds of work. That means that you're not able to maintain certain kinds of residencies, or it puts you at risk for certain kinds of, for further discrimination, being attacked by police, things like that. Also, queer folks have intersecting identities. So for Black queer folks, and disabled queer folks, and Native queer folks, Two-Spirit folks, there is, like, police brutality is a huge problem, right? So that's just, like, one little, that's just all the ways I could come up with while sitting right here, right? That like, queer political rights and social rights are connected to homelessness. I feel like I got off track again, which is totally fine, but AIDS. Oh, multiple histories, right? That there are, I think, a ton of different ways of reading history, and this is one way that I'm going to try to present to y'all, or one way of seeing multiple ways. Is sort of the focus on that. It's not always going to be about discrimination, although I think talking about discrimination is important. I think, like the AIDS crisis, where charges of genocide against the U.S. government were sort of thrown out by queer activists because nothing was done. The federal government, literally Ronald Reagan, it took him until like 87. That's actually not in his presidency. Anyway, it took him like fucking 10 years to say the word AIDS. So that has really colored my, like, politicization as a queer person. And yeah, that is sort of, so discrimination on the one hand, but also other ways of being, other ways of thinking about how the community's developed, other ways of developing ideas about sex and gender and sexuality, and just, you know, really I want to talk about butch femme and AIDS and the 1920s, where those categories sort of existed but didn't really. Yeah, no, Cassius, I appreciate it. I think that we live in a garbage capitalist system where that is a question that we have to grapple with. I don't think that normalization is something that is super concerning, but it also is something that I have to deal with, right? As a queer person, I'm in a PhD program because it's unlikely that I would be hired by high school and would still be allowed to be out as a queer trans person with my students. I think that is garbage. I would love to be teaching high school kids, even though it would probably kill me because teaching is a system, right? And the kinds of systems that we're asked to teach is garbage. So I chose to join a PhD program because it means that the odds of me getting hired, hilariously enough, with a PhD as a queer and trans person to teach is way higher than if I tried to teach at a high school or, God forbid, with younger kids, right? Because my students are over 18. Parents could object, but it's not a problem. And yeah, you're right, Susan, American high schools are, ugh. But that's right, that's why I would want to teach there, because I want to make those places better as much as I can as a person, you know, be a role model for a way of moving through the world that I didn't have as a young person. So I think, Kiz, just to answer your question, I think we make compromises and move through the world however we can. There are folks for whom they can't change appearance or behavior, right? And that, because that's who they are, and to be otherwise, right, is painful to them. And there are some folks who can do that and who can get hired, and it's fine. I think that in a dream world, in the future, in the beautiful future that I imagine, in the utopia which I refuse to give up, it wouldn't matter, right? And we would all be able to pursue the kinds of lives that we need to pursue, assuming that they don't harm other people. And literal harm, not assumed harm, right? Because it's not actually harmful for me to teach a Christian student about, I don't know, histories of the way that Christianity has has like been a part of settler colonialism. That does not actually hurt that student. That is history. That is one of the things I'm going to say is fact. So I think the answer, Ketchos, is it's complicated, which is going to be the answer 98% of the time. So, yeah. Ooh, it just welcomed me to the chat room. Are there people who are hopping in, or did I get kicked out? Yeah, Cassius, wherever you're living, I'd love to move there. Because there are hate crimes here. I do want to say one more thing, if I can, sort of about what I've gotten down in my notes is the twink thing. There's a lot to be said about the circulation. Yes, yeah, sorry, I'm drinking tea out of my Neoscum mug. It's cold tea now, but when I juggled it, so all the little bits that are floating around in it are just dancing. We're gonna let it sit. The twink thing. I really want to talk about the twink thing. The New York Times last week, time is fake, y'all. I don't know why I'm a historian. The New York Times recently has an article that it put out calling this it's like the moment of the twink or the year of the twink. I don't know what the fuck. I didn't read the article. I read the article in Twitter screenshot excerpts because I couldn't stand to read the article. There's a lot to be said about sort of straight misappropriation of queer culture and thinking about the ways that these things are normalized, and also misused. Like, I don't know if any of you watched the John Mulaney comedy special that was on Netflix. I don't know if it's even on international Netflix. I feel like all the people watching are international people, which is very funny to me. But he has a joke in there, which is like medium funny, about going down on a twink or something. And I was like, John Mulaney, you fucking learned 3 other gay words that aren't twink. And right, because it's basically, it's a word in queer culture that has been circulated so heavily that straight people know. And it's like fine, but I also want to be open and honest about the fact that, like, it is complicated, and a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about here are about communities to which I don't belong. I'm not a gay man. I'm not a trans woman of color. I'm not a lot of things, right? I laid out for you who I am. I really want to be honest and upfront about the fact that what I am presenting to you is not the Word of God. First of all, do I look like I know everything? No. I haven't washed my hair recently enough to do that. Sorry, that was a little gross. Every piece of knowledge that I'm giving you is based on my knowledge and my research, which, as I said, is really US and Anglophone limited. I'm doing some works of translation, not in other languages, but just trying to make it legible, and we're going to talk about legibility. Basically, legibility is a bunch of bullshit. Legibility is, legibility, I think, is all about complication, and it's all about misreading. And sometimes that misreading is intentional and done for safety, and sometimes that misreading is a really strong attempt to reach across and say, this is who I am, and I'm doing my best, and you're not going to understand it regardless. I don't expect folks, for example, to sort of attain my, like, level of rage about AIDS, mostly because I don't know that that's possible or healthy. But yeah, what I want to do here is not hand you off packages of information that you can then carry on and say, oh, look what my friend I said this, and therefore it's true. That's not how this works. What I am going to try to do is say, here is something that I carry with me that I know about, that here's what I think about it, right? Like, the subtitle on this is, I'm screaming my opines into the void, and you all get to sort of listen and ask questions. But there's also, most of what I know is old, right? I'm an old queer. So when I'm talking about things, it's often the culture, like queer culture and trans culture itself, is super fast moving. It is often super racialized and really classed. And as, like, a white middle class person, I don't have access, really. Like, I can identify with certain things, like butch culture. Butch culture is really heavily classed. I'm a middle class person. Butch culture, generally speaking, is pretty intensely working class. I identify with butch culture, but I also understand that, like, my position as a middle class white person means that what I can take from butch culture, I have to be careful with. They're gifts. So, yeah, most niche cultures are classed, fast-moving, and racial, Phil. So that's the real secret. But yeah, I just want to think of, I want us to think about what it means to be in sort of the twink moment, which, like, skinny white dudes have always been in. We're not in a new moment. Get back to me when the butches have the moment again, which we did, and we'll have again. My ascendancy is real. Yeah, so that's sort of just, I wanted to address the twink thing because I really feel like the twink thing in particular has sort of hit this cultural normativity where it's being misused all the time. And, right, Phil, isn't it a shock that really, you know, skinny, hairless white dudes are in vogue? Who'd have thought? But yeah, just that, like, we've hit this moment of sort of misappropriation and misinformation where it's just like, is it good to teach about, like, identity terms? I don't know. I'm going to be talking about them. I'm going to be talking about the cultures behind them. I'm going to try to do so in the most respectful way I can because I'm doing it for queer people. And I'm hoping that that's enough. And if it's not enough, we'll have to figure something out. But that is all I kind of had written down. We have like 9-ish minutes. God, I've been running for so long. Who knew I could talk for this long? You all did. I'm wondering if folks have any questions about me or about what this is going to be or any things they want to have future episodes or future streams about. I'm hoping that they will all maybe run about this time, maybe shorter, maybe we're like 45 minutes. So, any questions? I don't know, Phil, the children on Tumblr use twink all the time, and I use twink too, but also, twink has an overlap with a word that I won't say until we talk about the word, because, Twitch might get mad at me. I don't think Twitch will get mad at me for saying the word that I think is more culturally useful than what the word twink means, but. Oh, queerness and disability is actually a great thing. I know some stuff, but I will look more into the way that, like, crypt theory and like, Eli Clare is someone who's a disabled trans man. Phil, we can talk about the meaning of queer. Actually, I want to talk about queer and normalization, which might not answer your question, but, and maybe we'll talk about, I should really talk about Kathy Cohen to answer that question. You're not wholly wrong, with that one, but, if you add white in there, you basically have it. Yeah. So I can totally address those. Next time I'm going to talk about queer readings, and specifically about the work of Alexander Doty, which I'm really hyped to do, because I talk about him all the time. So, yeah. Anything else? Any other questions you have about me? I feel like I didn't say anything useful in this session, but maybe I'm wrong. Oh, there's so much tea left and so many frickin' twigs. Oh, this tea is extremely cold. Anything else? If not, we'll shut this off at 55 and call it a day. Cause I got stuff to do, as I'm sure you do. But you can always also hit me up on Twitter. I realize that, like, me being like, what do you want to know about right now? Is putting you under pressure. But you can always hit me up for folks that aren't following me, although I don't know how many of that is there. is there? Ooh, how many of you there are that aren't just following me? I'm at Yet Regressing on Twitter. Oh, Phil. I screamed. There's in my, in my reaction thread, I had some emotions. But I'm all for Dak Rambo, America's Fisting Bottom, 2K18, or whatever year they're in, 2K75, 76. I was pretty happy. Yeah, so, again, my Twitter account is at Yet Regressing, because I'm very bad at cross-branding on here. Plus, I've had that Twitter account for like 10 years, so what are you gonna do? And you can email me if you want. Look, Bruce Springsteen, we can talk about Bruce Springsteen if y'all want. I will do a whole episode just about the queer cultures of Bruce Springsteen. There are scholarly articles. Not about fisting, just about queer Bruce Springsteen. Yeah. Is Canada the fisting bottom of America? I don't know. I'd have to think that one over. I'd have to think a lot about Canada's historical receptivity. If you think I can't use fisting as a fucking analytical lens, I've read a lot about porn studies, and I can do whatever I want. I wrote an entire reading of John Wick using Lee Edelman's No Future, so I can do anything. Okay, I think we're clearly just sort of hopping off into bananas land, so I'm gonna go ahead and call it a day, but thank you so much for hanging out, and for asking questions, and I hope that you will enjoy our future conversations as much as I'm excited for them. So thank you guys. This is so weird. Have a good one.